Καλησπέρα, σας καλωσορίζουμε από τις...
Good evening. We would like to welcome you from Gutenberg Publications for the presentation about Kara Hoffman's book, The Runners, and this book was released recently. We have with us Mr. Lefteris Kalospiros, author and translator, and you can find this book at the stand number 23 at the entrance of the building, and it will be signed by the author.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so, this is going to be fun. Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to ask you if the book's like autobiographical in any sense. I am going to say, you were a runner yourself. The book is about runners. You're talking about like a time and a place that you're very, very intimately familiar with. To actually, I think more than like most Athenians, actually, in a way.
I would think so. I don't think there are many Athenians who were working in tourist hotels as runners in the 1980s. But I haven't met, if there are, I haven't met them yet.
Yeah, I haven't met them either. And, I grew up around that time and that place. But anyway, so here's what I want to start with. I read a lot of American fiction. And it very rarely seems to deal with kind of the realities of kind of life in the margins. Like homelessness isn't a thing, hunger isn't a thing, and especially when it comes to kind of not just American writing about Greece, but writing about Greece in general. There's like there's this thing where it's like it's a setting where like sun-drenched coasts and like wealthy travelers kind of hang around some beach. And they have some kind of personal epiphany. They come into contact with the ruins, which actually reminds me, Harry Kunzru has said something similar about the British novel, which is like, there's like the mystical mirror of the East. And there's like a British, invariably white male who comes to this East to kind of know himself.
Right.
And running does something very different. And I want to kind of I'm not the first person to call it kind of anti-colonial or counter-colonial. But I want you to talk about that aspect of the work.
Yeah, I think everything you say is true. We're really used to reading these novels, especially novels, maybe novels in translation, and definitely all of us in the West are used to reading these, reading fiction and reading novels in which there are locations like Greece or Morocco or the East, or places that are exoticized and orientalized and turned into something that's that in and of itself is supposed to be like the landscape in and of itself is something that the protagonist is conquering maybe, and this is not the case in running. It's not a situation where it's a super exotic location or the natives are interesting. I mean, they're interesting certainly, but the natives are so other that people are having epiphanies related to this landscape. It's more a landscape in which, well, first of all, the people who are the protagonists in running don't have money. The Greek people that they encounter are actually much better off than they are. And so in that, I think that's one of the ways that people have said that it's an anti or counter-colonial novel. It's dealing with homelessness, and it's dealing with sort of a vagabond life of people who are coming from the West, and in some ways, I mean, are runaways from the West and from all of the sort of horrible trickle-down effects that colonialism itself has on those kinds of populations. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, that leads to my next question very, very neatly. Right in the beginning of the book, when Milo and Bridie first meet, and she's just got to Athens, Milo keeps, basically tells her something like, the idea is not to stay in Athens. The idea is to get out of Athens. The idea is to go to the islands, because that's where, paradise is, whatever. Yeah. And then there is that, flashback to when Milo and Jasper first meet. and then Jasper shows him this map of the world and goes, the problem is there's no escape.
Yeah, there's no way out.
So, and then even as runners, their job is partly that, like, they leave the city and then they get on a train and come back into the city. So they're always kind of coming and going. And Bridie leaves Athens, comes back to search for her friends. So I want you to talk about this idea of, like, you mentioned kind of like running away from things also and kind of escaping. So I want you to talk about this idea about, like, freedom, escape. What's kind of the philosophical thing going on there in the book?
Right. Definitely, like, a thematic underpinning for the novel has to do with the concept of leaving and maybe continuously leaving. And I think so. Bridie, Jasper, and Milo, who are the protagonists of the book, are all runaways. They've all left their own lives in England and in the US, and they are looking for something anywhere. I mean, they're looking to keep moving, really. And Athens is a place where they end up finding a kind of freedom that they haven't been able to find in other places. So these are the protagonists, but they are in a constant state of, I would say, searching more than running. And I think I'm trying to like. I wonder if I'm actually answering your question. I think the I think the idea of this kind of freedom that they're looking in escape, or the inability to escape. These two things are constantly in conversation and in conflict throughout the entire book. How can we get away? How can we get even farther? How can we get even farther than that? And in essence, some of the ways that they're escaping are through transgressive actions that they're taking with their own bodies, a transgressive ways of thinking and ways of being. And so ultimately, part of the escape is not a geographic escape. It's not a geographic cure. It's one that has to be more of an internal journey.
Which again leads to my next question. This is great.
It's almost like we talked about this.
Because like, I was rereading the book now, and I was like, well, there's a fundamental kind of tension in the book between the idea of freedom and the idea of fear. And I think it's actually counterintuitive, what kind of fear. Because, so when we see Milo kind of in the kind of future, but present of the book, when he's like in New York and he has like a stable job, he has like an income, he's still kind of living as a runner. So even though he can afford kind of like, having a place to live in, and he doesn't have to sleep in the park, and he doesn't have to, just eat whatever he still does these things. And then he thinks about the people that he associates with through his work, and he thinks to himself that, all these people are kind of constantly afraid of things. They're afraid of dirt. They're afraid of the slightest discomfort. And he actually thinks that they don't have the kind of freedom that he used to have with, like, Jasper and Bridie. Actually, there's a quote from the book that I want to read. So yeah, the things that held people down had no more weight for him. He'd no fear of losing, or being poor, or ugly, or alone. No fear of being fired, or mocked, or doing wrong. Milo didn't just know how long he could go without respect. He knew how long he could go without food. And this thing keeps playing out in the book, and then, like, near the end of the book, Bridie has this, like, confrontation with, like, a rich American tourist. And it almost seems like she's trying to teach her exactly this idea that she kind of looks at the tourist and she thinks to herself that, this is a person who's, like, frightened of the unexpected. She's basically learned to do nothing whenever she feels afraid. And she actually says to her something like, after this is over, you'll be stronger and things won't seem that bad. So in this kind of idea that you've talked about, like freedom, escape, what I really want to talk about is there seems to be this concurrent treatment of the characters kind of having escaped certain types of fear that, like, kind of fundamentally shape the worlds that they're trying to escape from, and that everybody else doesn't seem to treat as fears, but as some kind of concrete reality.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I've been asked over and over again in discussing the book, and discussing my life as a runner when I lived here when I was young, if I was afraid, and this question keeps coming up, weren't you afraid? Weren't you afraid to sleep outside? Weren't you afraid to live like in a train station? Weren't you afraid? And I keep thinking to myself, how strange it is to be asked this question about fear all the time when the book is clearly about people who are not afraid to live outside and not afraid to live this life and not afraid to leave their country and not afraid to do these things. And so a huge part of all of the thematic the thematic strain that ties these things together actually is about desire and not fear. So it's like, not are you afraid, but what do you desire and what more do you desire and where more do you want to go and how can you test the limits of your desire and how can you go farther and really go to the limits of your longing and go to the limits of your desire. And I think the things that also like Bridie is a character who is, she is extremely brave in that she makes huge mistakes. She does things that are absolutely awful. The results of some of the decisions she makes are life-altering and life-ending for certain people. And yet she makes the decision to go back and to try to rectify these things and try to save what she can. And to me, I think the ideas about fear, it's so irrelevant. I never even thought, until I was asked questions about it, I never really thought of it. I mean, of course, we're afraid or we're uncomfortable, or there's situations that all of us as humans get into that are distressing. But this was not the case in the book. And I also think that there's such a good question about the kind of freedom that Milo feels. There's there's obviously like a strong queer thematic element to the book, and part of the freedom that Milo feels when he's thinking about the 80s compared to his life. He's a successful professor. He lives in New York City, but he's living in the era of a constant demand for definition, identity, and labeling. And Milo thinks, we had such an amazing freedom. We never had the thought of even calling ourselves by a name. We never thought to justify anything that we were doing with our bodies. We never thought about any sort of reaction to justify ourselves to the dominant culture, right? I think one of the things he says in the book, or one of the sentiments, is, I don't need a fascist to acknowledge my humanity. And I don't need a fascist to acknowledge my humanity, I think, is an extremely important idea here. Because when we're begging a fascist to allow us to live, we have already lost. We've lost so much. And so these are the themes that I think related to freedom and related to bravery that are so important about the book. We have to be able to have the bravery, the courage of our convictions, and we have to have the courage of our mistakes, to make our mistakes, and we have to have the courage to not like stamp every single person we see with a label, including ourselves. And these are certainly like the themes that I was working towards, dealing with freedom and fear.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask this now, because you mentioned the label thing, right?
Yeah.
So, like, all three of the main characters have, like, this kind of, like, non-traditional kind of queer punk lifestyle thing. But, like, ever since the book came out, there's a much kind of bigger conversation going on about, LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ literature and, like, queer fiction and what exactly is queer fiction. Would you call the book queer fiction if you had to put a label on it?
I wouldn't put a label on any book, really. I mean, when I think about these labels, I think of them as they exist for marketing purposes and branding purposes, right? We need to categorize the book and we need to put it in a particular section of the bookstore or the library, and like in that way it works, right? But I wouldn't necessarily call the work queer. I mean, so do we call Marguerite Duras' work queer fiction? I'm not comparing myself to Marguerite Duras, by the way. I'm just saying, when we're thinking about like great works of literature, these things aren't necessarily categorized in that way. That saying, I'm certainly not averse to the idea of people seeing the book as a queer book, or for people, you and I had a conversation recently about when we were young and the books that we gravitated to, and then only realizing later, yeah, okay, these people who were writing the books were like lesbian, bisexual, or, you know, in some cases like, you know, ended up transitioning, and like these books spoke to us. But the reason that they spoke to us is because they're written by humans and they're about human experiences, not because they're by a particular labeled entity, I think. I definitely don't want to I don't want to backpedal on the idea of the importance of queer literature. I just want to say that there's so much literature that people have read throughout their lives all the time that has been queer, right? Whether you know that the author is gay or not. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that actually makes, yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
feel
no.
free to push back if you disagree.
I actually don't want to push back in any way, because I completely agree.
Okay.
But, so in relation to that, because you mentioned the queer thing, and then kind of the idea of transgression, the idea of pushing limits. Now, I have a particular aversion to very kind of clear-cut, very good characters, very bad characters, you know, good versus evil. I can't really, I don't understand the thing. But what I find particularly interesting about the book is there's a very clear sense in which Bridie, her friends, they kind of routinely engage in behavior that is, you can say it morally questionable. They do make mistakes. Some of those mistakes are like big ones. They cost people a lot. There's no sense of the characters being judged in the book for all of this. There is a sense that these behaviors kind of are interrogated, but there's no sense that there's like a judgment. But what I want to know is, was that more of a case of you wanted to kind of document a kind of subculture? Was it a more kind of philosophical approach to, look, this is how I'm going to treat these characters because I want to draw attention to that fact, but without like the judgment inherent to kind of a more kind of normalizing conception of this kind of subculture?
Right. I mean, for sure, it's documenting the subculture, right? I mean, this is a huge amount of the work is taken from journals that I kept when I was a runner, things, you know, drafts that I wrote of the book when I was a runner, when I was young. The book invariably documents a subculture, and it is both sort of a vagabond life and a queer life, and things that I was, things that I took part in when I was young. And I think it's a good question. It's a really good question. But it doesn't end there. It's not just an attempt to write something that's strictly a document of that work. I think that's the clearest way that I can answer that question. I don't know if you want me to talk more about it. What's your thought?
I'll tell you what I thought. One of the reasons I picked up the book in the first place was because I read a really brave review of it, and then I saw the kind of the setting, and I was like, oh, this sounds like exactly the kind of thing I want to read. What I found interesting about it was that, on the one hand, I thought, well, you know, this kind of chimes with my experience of Athens in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, but also how quickly I moved past that. And like the stuff that I found really interesting was the kind of the kind of fictional element of kind of the kind of, it's not a morality play but, at all, but there is a strong sense of certain kind of categories of human life
Right.
being kind of investigated without the judgment element, and then me being called upon as a reader to kind of not necessarily even conclude about what the characters do, but
Yeah.
just to kind of interrogate it, just in that sense of these are people in a very particular situation. They make some decisions,
Yeah.
some not so great ones, and then all the people involved deal with those in different ways.
Right.
And then I have to kind of find my own way of kind of where do I stand
Your
in
own
all
moral
this.
stance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like the idea of thinking about any. I mean, I agree. Nobody wants to read a morality play. Nobody wants to read something like that. I don't like the. It's such a difficult question because we all have a point of view and we're all expressing. It's not that there's not a moral center or a moral basis for the work. So it's a complex question, actually. I think that I was not in any way trying to direct the reader in thinking about what is transgressive literature. I wasn't trying to do anything other than show people in their most human light. Part of the thing that has been disturbing to me in so much of literature is that you don't see characters who are poor, and you don't see characters who are just complete outsiders, I guess. I mean, so much of all of my writing, not just running, deals with the lives of outsiders. And one of the things I found most frustrating is that they're never depicted as having sort of longing or internal lives, or they're not depicted as having intelligence, or in many ways being well read, or being part of any kind of conversation at all. And in writing this work and in showing these different characters, especially characters who are really down and out, and showing them having internal lives, like serious internal lives, I think I know I was definitely pushing against the things that really bother me about a kind of bourgeois type literature that I feel ignores basically the majority, a huge swath of humanity. Most people aren't wealthy. Most people aren't even middle class. Most people don't live lives of educated people. Does that mean that they're not intelligent? No. Does it mean that they don't have desires and ideas and abilities? No, of course not. So I think in my writing about transgression, and I don't want to give too much away about the book, but in the things that I'm depicting and the things that I'm documenting about the subculture that have to do with transgression, those are definitely intentional ways of pushing back against the idea of a body of literature and a canon that is absolutely dominated, as regular life is dominated by a bourgeois culture.
Okay, that leads me to two questions. I had one question that I'm going to come back to in a second, because you said the whole thing about not wanting to direct the reader, and I think that kind of relates to what I had in mind. But since you mentioned it, and since I asked you about the LGBTQ plus kind of label, I want to ask about proletarian literature.
About
Proletarian literature,
yeah.
Because, so, there's a whole other conversation about that label, right? Because you can call somebody like Russell Banks proletarian literature, right? But then somebody like Dos Passos maybe, or Steinbeck, it's like, no, he writes about the poor, but he's not poor himself, therefore he's not proletarian literature. There's this whole thing where there's like two things happening at the same time. On one level, I'm kind of thinking, do I even want that label? Like, is the label useful in terms of it draws attention to the fact that most of us, when we think about literature, automatically assume some stuff about, it's going to be middle class or upper middle class. And then I kind of worry about, well, if you call it proletarian literature, are you suggesting that kind of the middle class bit of things is kind of the norm in a way, and then the proletarian literature is the exception?
Exactly.
But also it feels useful to me to have, to kind of even have that conception of
Yeah.
that kind of work.
Yeah.
And where do you stand on that? And where do you stand on the idea that somebody like Steinbeck can't be labeled that,
Yeah.
no matter how powerful the work is,
Yeah.
because he's not poor himself?
It's so interesting. It's such a great question. Again, I mean, we're dealing with labels, so do we want the label at all? That's first. Why can't it just be literature? I was having a conversation with someone today about just the logistics of people who are poor or people who are working, their ability to even write a novel, to be able to even engage in literature, right? It's so much of literature is dominated by people who already have money, and because they have the time to write. And those of us who have to do things like translate books to make money, or work in a factory, or people who are raising children and it's all, you know, that's all that they're doing with their time, or people who have a job and they're raising kids or whatever it is. These people can't actually engage in the process in the same way that other people. I mean, you're writing your book, and how are you? You're at a huge disadvantage. You're not able to produce the same word count per day if you're bartending or whatever, working in any number of shitty jobs that we've all had. So there's that. Like, how does a person even get to be, how do we even hear working class voices? We don't really. I mean, we can assume that there's all kinds of people who have jobs and who are like writing in their spare time and are good, and we'll never see their work. We'll never see it. It's just a whole body of literature that doesn't exist for the common reader, like in publication. How do we even find those people? It's just, we don't. It's an interesting question about Steinbeck. I would just go back to say that I'm not a fan of labels in general. And I think like Steinbeck is absolutely, I mean, the work is important. The person is an ally to talking about things that are some of the most important things in American literature, some of the most important events in American history, right? I don't think that, I'm trying to think of who, so Winter's Bone is one of my favorite novels, right? I think it's I think Daniel Woodrell is an incredible, incredible example of writing about the poor people, right? Poor people and working people. And I think Woodrell has done this amazing job also in his personal life of avoiding the traps that come with class, of being elevated out of your class and no longer a part of the conversation, no longer a part of understanding, no longer a part of the world you came from. And Cynthia Cruz, also amazing writer Cynthia Cruz, who has a book coming out called Steady Diet of Nothing, and who's written The Melancholy of Class, which is an incredibly important nonfiction book, talks about how class is sort of the only thing, the only demographic category label we have where the desire is, if you're working class, is to escape that. And then you're so alienated once you've escaped that, once you've left that. I mean, I personally had the experience of, you know, I grew up in northern Appalachia, and, you know, and had, you know, certain periods of poverty in raising my son as a single mother. And then my first book was very successful, and I moved to New York City, and like that, I was completely taken out of my environment. And it was everything you dream about, and it's like everything you dream about and also a complete nightmare. And not realizing that the people who, the majority of people, and a friend had told me, the real surprise you're going to find is that everybody who's publishing around you is rich. Because in my mind, I was like, this is fantastic. I've published a book, and now I just get to go meet all the other people who love literature and books, and we'll have conversations about literature and books. But the majority of the conversations were conversations about deals and advances, and it was really startling to me. Although I was definitely happy that I could, you know, not shop at thrift stores anymore and things like that. And like, I was happy for the change, but it's also, there's a grief there. There's something to get through. We've talked way too much about class, probably. I'm like, I've never talked this much about class on my U.S. book tours, ever.
I got, you know what? That's fine actually, because, okay, brief aside, I went to this a couple of months ago. There was like this mini conference for like young Greek writers that I attended to kind of hear some of my acquaintances and friends speak. And one of the things that kind of again and again wouldn't come up, or at least some of the people present would try to kind of shut it down when it came up, was exactly the idea that a lot of people were asked, you know, why isn't your generation producing more books? Why aren't you writing faster? Why are you writing all these like 100-page short novellas? And Lefteris Kalospiros, who was there, kind of basically kind of touched exactly on that. He was like, well, you know, most of us have to work like 12, 14-hour days to make a living.
Exactly.
A lot of us have like 2 jobs. And then, you know, you've worked 14 hours a day and then you go back home. Are you going to write like a 450-page long, very complex novel? I mean, you can try, but how long is it going to take?
Yeah, a long time.
And
You
I
would
think
know.
like that's I mean that's like an aspect of like writing that like doesn't come up in that sense. Like the issue of money in writing comes up usually when it's like, oh, so and so made a crap load of money writing.
Exactly.
But then the bit where you actually have to kind of balance it out with like making a living doesn't, you know, it's like nobody really wants to talk about that.
It's true. It's very interesting, isn't it? Who gets to be elevated to being a genius and who is never ever seen or heard. Yeah.
Okay, I want to come back to the whole I don't want to direct the reader thing.
Okay.
So here's the other thing. The second time around, here's what I noticed about the book. Obviously, it moves around in space because it moves between Athens and New York and Washington State. It moves around in time because it moves, you know, between past and present. But it also moves around between first and third person. You get Bridie, you get Milo. And that's fine, but here's what I found really interesting, right? Usually when you get a novel that has this kind of like shift between like voices and first, third person and stuff, I think most writers tend to kind of try and find some kind of organizing principle for the thing. Even if it is subsumed, it has to kind of be there, something that kind of, you know, justifies or kind of explains these shifts. And then sort of as if everything is becoming kind of integrated through some kind of textual intelligence. There is a kind of central intelligence to the book, right? And God knows I did that in mine. But it seems to me that running just refuses to do that. And there is a sense in which it just read to me all of a sudden like it's part of the book's kind of anti-authoritarianism in a way. It's like this rejection of the idea that there's going to be kind of an all-controlling textual authority that just presides over everything.
Yeah.
Am I completely off?
No, you're completely on. You're completely right. And I would say, so my first book definitely had an organizing principle. It had multiple timelines. It was a completely fragmented work, so much pretty. And it had several different timelines and several different voices in it. And the publisher I was with at the time and the editor I was working with at the time, Simon & Schuster, wanted date lines and labels written. And it worked well because it was written from part of it was written from the perspective of a journalist who was like searching through things. And I worked as a long time as a journalist, and you have all these different documents that you're putting together. So that worked. I was extremely, extremely lucky to work with Iris Silverberg on this book. Iris Silverberg, who is a very important figure in the transgressive literary world. He was my editor at the time, and I had started to maybe think about, I'll actually label the voice here that we're going to hear next. This is Bridie we'll be hearing. Oh, this is Milo we'll be hearing. And he read through it and was like, yeah, let's just get rid of all that shit. Let's just dump it. Like, let's just pour it on the page. And Iris Silverberg's, older people here may know him because he put out an anthology, the High Risk Anthologies, which were dealing with extremely transgressive writing, and, you know, just like the Burroughs and David Wojnarowicz and just like a Dennis Cooper, like incredibly great works, and Kathy Acker. And so he's just like fearless about all of this stuff. And in fact, I had initially written it this way, and I had no desire to stamp labels on it or have anything to do with it. And I always trust the reader to be really smart, and I've never understood it. I've never understood when people push against that, and they think, oh, the reader won't be able to figure it out. I mean, the reader can figure all kinds of stuff out, and if they don't like it, they can put the book down, right? It's simple. So I've always trusted the intelligence of the reader and the ability to figure these things out, and I've always had a completely anti-authoritarian view of the world and how these things work. So no, you're right on the money there. Yeah.
Is that also why? Because I like the way that the characters kind of come in and out of the book. There's a very kind of sense of, this is like real life. There's no guarantee that just because a character comes into the book and then we see them for a few pages, they're going to come back and play some kind of significant role in the plot or something. It's just like people are kind of coming and going. Right. Which kind of fits that kind of lifestyle.
Well, it
where
wouldn't
you just
be
travel
honest.
around.
Yeah, it wouldn't be honest. It wouldn't be honest to the life. I mean, like I'm writing about the life of people who were completely transient workers, and it wouldn't be honest to anything about that if we suddenly saw everything tying up in a neat little package. And also, I mean, the New York City parts too. Milo, the character Milo, is dealing with extreme grief and extreme guilt over the role that he played in the lives of his friends and in the lives of certain strangers when he was a runner. And he's seeking to constantly remove himself, and he's seeking to constantly be floating, basically, to be outside of things when he's in New York City. And it wouldn't be true to the life that he's trying to live or the life that he lives if, he at one point in New York, Milo starts sleeping with a homeless man, and the character, I mean, I loved writing the character, and I think he's a good and important character, but he's a homeless person and he disappears. He's not.
Yeah, he's actually one of the characters I had in mind.
Exactly. Yeah, Steve. He doesn't. He's a good person, and like clearly there's a relationship there, but it's in certain ways it's very one-sided. Yeah.
Which kind of leads me to, as I mentioned, the whole thing about Milo having like a stable income, having a job, and yet very clearly in the book, like there's this wonderful bit where he's like, he keeps forgetting that he has money to like go out and buy food, so he'll just like eat whatever.
Yeah.
But what I find fascinating is, like, it reads like that kind of behavior is not, he's not recapitulating some kind of trauma. He's basically gained the kind of freedom, and then just because he now has a job and then money and a place to live, he's like, well, I'm not gonna give that freedom up,
yeah.
right?
I'm not gonna give up the power that I had to be able to be that kind of person, I think is really a part of it. I can remember, I mean, early on when I was with my partner in New York City, I can remember saying one time that I was going to go sleep in Tompkins Square Park one night, and he was like, I think that's a really bad idea. I don't think that's something that you should do. And it was like part of writing. It was actually part of like working on this book, which I was working on the rewrite of the book, and I was working on feeling like the freedom and the power of doing that. It would be amazing. I wish that in some ways that I had done that, but it would have been a really stupid thing to do. But certainly, there are all kinds of things that I think we should. I think it's just really important for us to remember what we give up for our comfort. And often we give up things that are like, it's fine. It's great to not sleep on like a cardboard pallet or whatever. But there are certain things that there are certain ways of being that you adopt as a human being, or certain ways of understanding the world. And part of it has to do with trust, and part of it has to do with understanding and seeing through people as types, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe we all need to go sleep in a train station and see how we would feel. See how we would feel afterwards. I mean, probably a little bit like cramped.
Stiff, yeah.
Yeah, stiff. But yeah. But to be able to look at the world in a way where we're not terrorized by it is really important. And to be able to look at people who we might fear as human beings and to approach them as human beings instead of approaching them with fear or disdain or denigrating who they are, looking at them as types.
Like, one of the things that I was thinking about, again, rereading the book, was this idea of kind of the difference between caution and fear. Like, the characters exist in a kind of part of town and at a time and place where, you know, there are certain kind of risks to kind of being there, right? They don't treat that situation with any kind of sense of fear, which is, it's a kind of, fear is an
Right.
inner-directed thing. It's essentially kind of a refusal to kind of engage with this environment.
Right.
They treat it with caution, which is like it's a kind of outward-directed thing, because caution requires you to kind of actually interact with that environment. It actually requires you to know something about it
Yeah.
in order to determine what it is you need to be cautious
To know,
of.
to know something about it and to actually use your, like, to be able to have the, use your body and your mind for what your body and your mind are meant for, right? Like, our bodies are like these amazing, incredible sensory machines. And we can tell often when something's wrong or when something's off. And I think that's part of it. Like, we can be cautious, we can be aware. I mean, we're made to be aware. That's like who we are. But living in fear is, I mean, often the other thing is like fear is often like a top-down thing, right? Like, we are constantly being told to be afraid of certain people because it benefits people in power. So we're constantly being told, I mean, you think in like the US and also here, we're constantly being told now to be afraid of migrants, right? Be afraid of them. Be afraid of minorities, be afraid of migrants, be afraid of poor people. These people are going to take something from you, they're going to harm you, and they're going to do, and that whole message, I mean, if you, like, how much experience, direct experience do people have with those people? Practically none, right? And all of those messages of fear are being given to people from the top down. That's, we want to avoid that as much as we can, but we want to be able to be cautious. Right, and we're also told we're told that the police are our friends and that the police are here to protect us, and we know that the police are here to make the societal order as it is. But are the police here to protect us? Are the police our friends? You know, if we were really paying attention to how we feel in our bodies when we see them, would we how would we really react if we're really paying attention? If we're being cautious? If we're like thinking about our instincts rather than what we've been told? Yeah.
Okay, which leads to one last question, because I think it all kind of ties in that, I mean, it's going to be quasi-personal, but I think we can live with it. Because you mentioned the whole kind of experience and kind of going out there. The one thing I want you to kind of talk to me about a bit is, because you mentioned the transience thing and that kind of nomadic lifestyle. And obviously, that kind of thing is like gone now. Like, even traveling now is like you travel with a phone, and then you never even have to interact with another single human being. You just look at your phone, and it tells you where to go, and it tells you where to eat, and it tells you where to sleep. And like that aspect of kind of interacting with the world you move through is kind of gone in a way.
It's so amazing to hear you just say your phone tells you where to eat, tells you who to talk to, and tells you where to eat, and tells you where to sleep. And it's crazy to think that we have this device that's just, you know, developed by like a corporation that you carry with you everywhere, and that determines all the things you're going to do. And we know that like different corporations pay for their advertisement to be at the top of these lists, where you'll go, where you'll stay, where you'll eat, who you'll talk to, what you'll watch. Like, it's crazy, right? That's nuts. Was there a question there? I'm just agreeing with you. I think that, no, yeah, I mean, I think that's crazy. I think the thing that's saddest about losing that nomadic lifestyle, even not the nomadic lifestyle, even just regular middle class traveling on a car trip with your family where you had a road map or you had to stop and ask directions or something like that, that we've lost, not just, we haven't just lost the ability to read a map, we've lost the ability to be lost. And like losing the ability to be lost is horrible because you find out so many amazing things when you get lost. It's been great. You know, I've never been to Thessaloniki before, so it's been great getting lost in Thessaloniki and wandering around and seeing things here. And those novel experiences and the conversations that you can have and all of it is, it's in danger. And our humanity is in danger. Soon we'll all have AI buddies that will chat with us and tell us what to do. I read recently that there are AI friends that you can text with, and you can program them to be any way you want. So you can have like, you can program a clingy girlfriend to like text you all the time. You can, you know, program like your, you know, whatever college guy with a heart of gold bro buddy, and you can text these people and interact with them just as you do with your friends, except they're never real. You can never meet them in real life. You can never see them in real life. And
you can never be disappointed by them or upset with them, or they might want something else than
nothing. Click, they're gone, right? It's amazing. And I think it's not that inconceivable that we went from being people who could read maps and talk to each other, stop for directions, get lost, to people who have to like stare like very closely into a phone to know where we're going to eat, sleep, what we're going to do. I think it's not inconceivable that we'll end up being people who don't even have a need for people, or don't know that we have a need for people, don't know it and don't recognize it and don't understand that we're being depleted in this way. Really bummer of a question to end on.
No, wait. Speaking of a need for people, we can ask people to ask us questions.
Yes.
We'll ask you questions.
Yes, please ask us questions. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, first of all, for the interesting conversation and for introducing the wonderful book to us.
Thank you.
I was wondering, since you've lived in Athens for a long time, so what is the experience like to now publish? I think this is the first translation of your work in Greek, and also perhaps some words about your collaboration with the translator Panayotis Kekarias.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
It's an amazing experience. I've been saying that it's like feels in many ways like the pinnacle of my career so far. It's absolutely full circle. I started writing this book when I was 19 years old, living in a hotel across from Larissus, and now I'm sitting here in Thessaloniki speaking to you, and it's translated, and that feels to me. That's the neat little package I would never write if I was writing the story of it. I'm really, really happy also working with Panayotis. He's like an incredibly talented, amazingly conscientious, extremely articulate, you know, he's a beautiful writer himself, and he's done an amazing job with the book, and so it was a seamless and joyful experience working with him. And of course, Athens is, I've lived in Athens a long time because I love it here. It's really one of my absolute favorite places in the world. I mean, I love it in Athens. I'm sure I would love Thessaloniki if I spent more time here. But yeah, it's been really an important experience. Thank you for your question. Yeah. Anybody else? No.
I think we can.
All right.
Should we end it here?
We can end it here, I guess. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening, and thank you so much.